Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at a couple of my skill acquisition studies that have recently come out. How does variability in practice conditions influence the coordination of degrees of freedom? And a direct comparison between prescriptive instruction, differential learning, and a constraints-led approach. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I thought I would tell you about a couple recent studies I've completed looking at issues related to motor learning, skill acquisition, and different methods in training. The first one I want to talk about is one that came out a couple months ago in the Frontiers in Psychology. And then the one I want to get to afterwards is a study that I just had accepted for publication. It's just kind of in preprint stage, in which I tried to directly compare prescriptive instruction, differential learning, and a constraints-led approach. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about these, and I'm just going to kind of go off the cuff here and describe what I did in each of these. So the first one, as I mentioned, is the one in Frontiers in Psychology. And for this study, what I did was I took some data from a previous study I published. So I've talked about this on the podcast a few times before, but in 2017, I published the results from this large, in the end, it was a 10-year training study that I did looking at the transfer of training of different types of training in my batting virtual environment. And just to refresh your memory, if you don't remember, I had 4 groups in that study. So I had a control group that just did regular baseball practice. These were high school baseball players. A group that did extra batting practice. So they did real batting practice against a batting machine. Then I had a group in the virtual environment that did the same type of extra batting practice. And in both of these batting practices, I used the traditional method, where the variability is quite low in the conditions, right? The setting on the pitching machine is kept the same for a block of trials in terms of the pitch type, the speed, the location. So it's very blocked low variability training, both in the real and the virtual setting. And then the last group is the one that I really cared about and I was really interested in, was what I called the VE, or Virtual Environment Adaptive Group. That group did extra batting in the virtual environment, but the difference was there was much larger variability in practice conditions. The speeds and the pitch types and locations were varied according to the performance, actually. So if you look at the paper, the changes followed a staircase method, right? So what happened? So essentially, I would throw you an 80-mile-an-hour pitch. If you could hit that successfully, then the pitch speed would go up. And if you could hit that successfully, the pitch speed would go up again. So we'd find kind of a variability in the range of pitch speeds and the kind of the mean pitch speeds that you could handle and was challenging the batter at the right level. So it was a combination of more variability in terms of pitch speed, pitch location, and pitch type, and also challenging people at the right level. And the main result of that study was that this VE adaptive group did better, right? They did better on tests in the virtual environment for both hitting and pitch recognition, whether it's a fastball or a curveball. They did better in real tests of hitting off a pitching machine. And kind of most importantly, they showed greater evidence of transfer in a couple different ways. One is I measured their performance in the season after the completed training, and I looked at some batting statistics, and they did better than all the other groups. And then I also followed them for 5 years and looked at the highest level of play they reached, right? Did they get drafted in professional baseball? Did they play college? And a greater proportion of the players in the VE adaptive group made higher levels. Okay, so there's some pretty good evidence that that training worked. So this new study I just published in Frontiers, I wanted to look at more why, right? Why exactly did this group do better? And in particular, I wanted to focus on coordinating the degrees of freedom, right? And solving kind of the degrees of freedom problem. And I wanted to look at in terms of Bernstein's kind of conception of freezing and freeing degrees of freedom. So what I did in this new study was took data that I collected but never published from that 2017 study. In particular, I collected ground reaction force data. So there was force plates under the batter's feet, right, covering the area under by the plate. And from that, what I could do was divide the swing into different phases. Using both that and the motion tracking on the bat, I could look at when the batter was shifting their weight backwards, when they were lifting their front foot off the ground, when they were putting it back down, when they were shifting their weight towards the ball, and then finally when they started their swing. And for this, I used the categories or the different types of phases defined by Katsumata in 2007, which I talked about back in the episode on coordinative structures, right? So I did this. So in the paper, you'll see that I review, if you look at it, all previous studies that have looked at solving the degrees of freedom problem. Typically, it's done in terms of joint angles and ranges. So this is, remember, the degrees of freedom problem can be understood at different functional levels of the movement system, right? Not just in terms of coordination of angles, right? I'm looking at it in terms of the coordination of timing, right? So it's just a different level of looking at, so it's a degrees of freedom problem also exists at the level of timing, right? You need to get the timing of the different movements correct, right? So this is what I did. I looked at these ground reaction forces, and then I looked at a bunch of different aspects of this. Again, kind of mirroring some of the analyses that Katsumata did in his studies, kind of identifying coordinative structures, right? And some of the main things I found, so I looked at a bunch of different things. The first thing I found was I looked at the variability in timing of each of the phases, right? So in hitting, right, the first thing you do is you lift your front foot off the ground, right? Then you bring it back down, okay? Then you shift your weight, then you swing, then the bat gets to the ball, right? So what I looked at was the variability of the standard deviation and timing of all these phases, right? And what I found was that the variability went down, 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 down from each phase, right? So the variability in when you landed your front foot was much higher than the variability in the timing of when people shifted their weight, which is higher than the variability of when they started their swing, which was higher than the variability of the bat reaching the zone, right? So standard deviation is going down in a funnel type pattern. And this is a characteristic of online prospective control, right? There's no possible way you can have the variability in a movement decrease if you're using a pre-programmed ballistic movement, right? If you're not modifying a movement online, it cannot go down, right? It could only at best stay the same, but more likely go up, right? Because you can't correct it online. So strong evidence that batters aren't just, judging what the pitch is and then swinging, doing a pre-programmed swing. So evidence they're using prospective control. But interestingly, for the training effect, I found that this reduction in variability was greater after training, right? So not only are they using online control, but they're using it more effectively after training to adjust their movements, okay? Interestingly, I found if you look at some of the phases, the earlier phases, the variability actually got bigger after training. So again, this message that getting good at a skill is not reducing variability to zero, right? And I'll get back to that in a second. So that was kind of the one of the main findings I found. The next thing I did was to look at the coupling between phases, right? So if we're going to get this reduction in variability as we go, this funnel type thing, we're going to need to coordinate between the phases, have functional variability. So the idea is, so if I step too early, right? So I start shifting my weight towards the pitch too early. I'm going to need to adjust something later on in the swing to compensate for that, right? Because if I just keep that going, then I'm going to be way too early for the pitch. So what Katsumata found is people seem to have a relationship between the different phases, and that's exactly what I found right? If you look at the relationship between the timing of the landing phase and the time between landing and swinging, and also the same for waiting and waiting versus swinging, what I found is very strong correlations, right? So if you shift your weight too early, you take a little bit longer to start your swing, right? You're compensating this compensatory variability, very functional, right? You're adapting one movement to the other. You're not using the same movement all the time. You're letting them vary and compensate for each other in a coordinative structure, right? So I found that. And again, this increased after training. The correlations, this functional link increase got stronger with more training, okay? So that was another finding. The third one, main thing I did was I did kind of a conceptual replication of a uncontrolled manifold analysis. So this is something I've talked about on the podcast a few times, right? An uncontrolled manifold analysis is actually a very involved mathematical process where you need joint data or something like that. And you separate movement variability into good and bad, right? And so I did this conceptually. So what I did was I divided the swing into two parts, right? Shifting your weight away from the ball and shifting your weight from the time the ball is released to when you shift your weight back, from the weight shift back, weight shift forward to the actual swing, right? So I divided it into two of these phases. When you do that with a movement, you can define a temporal constraint, right? So any combination of shifting your weight forward and shifting your weight back has to add up to equal the time it takes the ball to get there, right? If they add up to too much, the bat's going to be in the zone when the ball's already gone by. If they're too fast, it's going to get there too early. So using that, what I can do is define good and bad variability, right? So bad variability is any change in the timing of the weight forward and back that is going to cause the sum of them to take you out of the task constraint. So the task constraint I can define, the constraint, the temporal constraint I can find is, if the pitch gets there in 400 milliseconds, plus or minus some margin for error, which is about 10 milliseconds in hitting. If your combination of these two phases is taking you out of that range, then that's bad variability because you're not going to achieve your goal. You're not going to hit the ball. Good variability, and as I've said in previous episodes, this is probably better termed potentially good variability, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It's just having it allows for you to adjust, the potential to adjust. So good variability in my analysis is any combination of a change in this timing that keeps the within the temporal constraint. So if I shift my weight back a little early, then delay my shift of my weight forward by a little bit, those two still add up to, so they're compensating for each other. So I can have different combinations of forward and backward weight shifts that still satisfy this temporal constraint, right? And so you get this, good variability is keeping things within this temporal constraint. And so what I found was, again, after training, the good variability went up, right? And the bad variability went down, right? So again, swinging, becoming better at hitting and all these effects I found was not producing a highly repeatable swing. Not at all. Right? There's still tons of variability from pitch to pitch in the swing. There's just different kinds of variability, right? It's variability, functional variability, compensatory variability that was keeping you in this zone. Okay, so that was a really interesting finding. And again, I found all these findings I've described so far, the good versus bad variability, the correlation of functional between the phases, and the funnel type decrease in standard deviation were all greater for the adaptive group in my study. So, and sometimes the other ones were not significant for the other groups. The last thing I wanted to do, and I should mention, if you look at the paper, you'll see there are some, on an individual level, there was a relationship between the changes in good and bad variability and the actual hitting performance. So batters that had more change in good variability actually hit better, right? So the last thing I wanted to do was I wanted to throw in a little bit of individual constraints here. So what I did was in the study, in the original training study in 2017, we also measured the maximum bat speed a batter can generate. So basically, it's not as simple as just having them swing and measuring the velocity. It is within a certain part of the zone. But basically, how hard can you swing the bat? How much velocity could generate? And why this is important, because this is kind of a capacity, an individual constraint that's going to limit your ability to adjust, right? So within the good variability, if I can't swing as fast, right, I can't wait as long, right, to start my swing, right? So people that, what I hypothesized was people that had more bat speed, more capacity, different individual constraints would be able to have more good variability, right? Because they could go over a bigger range. And that's exactly what we found. What I found was a correlation, right? So I think this study shows in some that, being a good hitter is not about one repeatable swing. It's about having adjusting the swing to the different conditions, pitch speeds, pitch types, right? And through coordinating the degrees of freedom, in this case in timing. And all of that is facilitated by having variability in practice conditions, and this be adaptive. So that was the one study I've done, and I'm guessing many people have heard that one before, or seen that already. But if you haven't, please, it's an open access one, so check it out. Or if you want, I can happily send you a copy. So that's the one study. The other one I want to mention, as I said, just is in preprint stage. It was just accepted. This one, what I wanted to do was to compare different methods. And this is kind of a continuation of something I was trying to do back in, probably some of you have seen in 2018, I did a study of training batters to increase their launch angle. Right. So, and looking at constraints-led approach versus two different types of verbal instruction, prescriptive instruction, external or internal. I think this is really important to try to keep comparing these methods, right? And I talked about back on the podcast when I talked about prescriptive instruction versus self-organization. I talked about the research that's already out there. I think by my count, there's 8 or 9 studies now that have made some comparison between these things. So for this, I wanted to add to that literature and do some more comparisons and some things. So what I did for this was I was looking at the skill of hitting a baseball to the opposite field, right? So if you're standing on the right side of the plate, as viewed from the pitcher's mound, it's hitting it to the left, right? So across your body. And the reason I chose this is something I've studied before. But also I like it because it has kind of 2 different components, right? It has a coordination component, like obviously to direct a ball to the opposite field, right? Hit it in the opposite way. I'm going to need to swing in a certain way. I'm going to need to have a certain coordination pattern. And there's some good studies. McIntyre did a study several years ago showing the different, elbow joint angles and wrist angles involved in. So there's a movement coordination component. There's also kind of an action selection affordance component, right? If you're going to try to hit a baseball to the opposite field, it's much easier for what we call outside pitches, balls that are further from your body. They're in the outer half of the plate relative to your body. So there's certain pitch types that afford hitting to the opposite field more than others, right? So it had these 2 components. So what I did was I compared 4 different training groups for learning this task, again, in the virtual environment. First of all, there was a control group that just did regular baseball practice between the pre and post tests. Then there was a prescriptive instruction group again. So this group, and this study is framed, if you look at it, again, framing a contrast between a prescriptive instruction approach, right, trying to teach people an optimal technique versus self-organization approaches, letting people find their own technique. So the prescriptive instruction, I did was to use verbal cues. These are ones derived from a hitting manual and common instructions, like turn your belt buckle towards the second baseman, lead with your lower hand, these kind of things. And they're ones that I've also used in other studies. So they're basically just cues designed to get you to perform the correct technique, right? And a key point in here is one of those cues was look for outside pitches, right? So we're kind of explicitly telling people about this action selection issue. So that was the prescriptive instruction group. That was the second group. The third group was a constraints-led approach group. So in the constraints-led approach, remember what we're trying to do is add a constraint to the practice task that's going to kind of remove a solution, move a movement solution, and encourage you to explore other ones, right? So what I wanted to do with this is remove movement solutions that tend to make you pull the ball, hit it to the same side field, right? And force you to do other type of swings. So for this, there was 3 types of constraints. The first was a barrier across the plate, essentially, that if you tried to, if you did a swing that would tend to pull the ball, you'd hit the barrier, right? You had to kind of go inside out your swing. You can read the paper if you want more details. And in the paper too, I have links to videos showing these. They're not the ones not from my lab, but these are commonly used practice methods. So basically, any kind of swing that would lead to pulling the ball you'd hit the barrier. So batters were just given the instruction, don't hit the barrier, right? So I'm not telling them how to do and hit the ball the opposite field. I've just added this constraint that removes that as a solution. So that was one. The second one was having a stepping barrier. So that was an obstacle on the ground that prevented batters from stepping away from the plate or opening up when they swing. Again, this is going to tend to lead you to pull the ball, right? So it's a movement. It's going to lead to a movement solution that's not going to get the goal, right? So again, we're trying to take that away by adding the constraint. So again, batters are just told you can't step over the barrier. And the final one was using a connection ball, which I've talked about a bunch on the podcast. Basically, it's holding a rubber ball. In this case, it was between your back arm furthest from the pitcher and in your body. And batters were just told, try to keep that ball in place and keep it from falling out as long as possible up to the point of bat contact. Because pulling your arm away from your body is, again, a type of pattern that's going to lead to pulling the ball, right? So, again, not telling the batters how to solve the movement problem, just adding something to the task that takes away a movement solution that will lead to not succeeding in what we want and pushing them to do something else, right? We're not telling them what the other thing was. So that was the third group, constraints group. The fourth group was differential learning group, right? So in differential learning group, we're not trying to push you away from a certain solution or guide you towards others. We're trying to get you to explore the whole solution space, right? So you get to find something that works for you. So for this condition, what I did was I modeled this after Schulhorn and colleagues' other studies on, speed skating and shot put and some of their soccer studies. Basically, I made a different sets of variables that could vary. So for example, your stance, whether it was your normal width stance, your narrow stance, or wider stance. Then I varied where you held the bat, your normal position, low or high. Then I varied the pitch height. Did it come in low, medium, or high? Pitch speed, slow, fast. So I had all these different variables, and basically on every trial, we picked a random combination of those, right? So in some trials, you'd have to use a wider stance with your bat held high. The pitch was coming in low at the fast speed, right? And then the next trial would be something totally different, right? So what we're trying to do here is get you to experience the whole solution space without really any guiding or removing particular solutions. Okay, so those are the 4 training methods that were used. What was found? Okay, so first of all, what was measured? So in the pre and post test, batters they were told to hit the ball to opposite field. To try to get at this action selection affordance issue, what I did was 3/4 of the pitches were on the outside of the plate, which is good for opposite field hitting. 1/4 of them were on the inside, which is not. Batters were told if you hit to the opposite field, you get 1 point. If you hit to the pull field, you lose half a point, right? So they were kind of encouraged, and if they didn't swing at all, they got 0. So they're kind of encouraged there to lay off the pitches inside, right? Based on the scoring system, which I know that's a constraint of this experiment, right? The scoring system I used. So we did that pre and post. We looked at the number of points they got, the number of swings they made at those inside non-optimal pitches, and things. Also, I looked at the contact point. Where did they contact the ball in space relative to the plate? And what we found is something interesting. What we found is, overall, if you look at just for pitches on the outside, how effectively could people put it in play in the opposite field? What I found and what I expected, based on kind of my bias, I admit, in my methods I prefer, the differential learning group and the constraints-led approach group did better. Right? They had more opposite field hits. The reason I expected that to happen is giving you this self-organization in whether it's constraints, kind of pushing you to try something new, or differential learning, making you try different combinations, presumably is going to make you more adaptable, is going to let you find a solution that's better for your own individual constraints. So that's what we theorize is what's going on there, right? It's helping you learn the coordination better. So those two groups were the best. The prescriptive group got better, but they were no better than the control groups. They weren't significantly better. So that was one thing. The second thing was when we looked at whether batters swung at inside pitches and how often they actually hit the ball to the wrong field and were penalized. And interestingly, what we found there was, first, not surprisingly, the prescriptive instruction group did well here, right? They didn't swing at many inside pitches and they didn't hit as many balls to the pull field, right? Because they were explicitly told not to. So they presumably developed a conscious, explicit strategy. But interestingly, the CLA group also did this, right? They also stopped swinging at inside pitches and hit less to the pull field, even though they were never told to. And what I hypothesized is they just learned to attune to the information from the pitches and pick up the affordance, because the constraints, right? If you swung at an inside pitch in training, it would tend to lead you to swing across the barrier, step over the border, or have the connection ball fall out. So I think these things help batters become attuned to the information and pick up the relevant affordances, that outside pitches are what afford opposite field hitting. The differential learning group didn't pick this up, right? They still had as many pitches as at inside pitches as the control group, and they had as many penalized pull hits. Okay, so the combination of these two effects meant that the constraints-led group did best overall, right? So they had, both effects were beneficial. They had improved movement coordination in terms of opposite field hitting and affordance perception. Whereas, so their change in total amount of points was greater than any of the other groups. The last thing we found was in terms of the contact point, as what expected, both the differential learning and the constraints-led group had more variability in the contact point. So they're actually contacting the ball at different locations depending on the pitch location, different depths. So they're using more variability in their actual swing, okay, in the parameters of the swing. So it's kind of what it expected. So overall, I think, as I said, hopefully this adds a little bit to this comparison and contrast. I think this understanding the contrasts between differential learning and constraints-led approach in particular we need more of that. You know, in the paper, you'll see I acknowledge there's some potential limitations. You know, maybe I didn't have the right amount of variability in practice conditions for the differential learning group, given that they're fairly experienced baseball players, things like that. You know, I could have changed the prescriptive instructions to be more externally focused, things like that. So it's hard to get everything directly comparable in these, but I think we need more studies like this comparing and contrasting. So that's, as I said, that study is soon coming out. In the show notes here, I have a link to, you can see the preprint, just the abstract. If you want more information, please let me know. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. I hear the winter. Cut you